Today we're going to talk about powerful storytelling. It's something that's very close to my heart. I've sort of been working within the charity sector for about 10 years now, and it's something that I've really found to be so moving and one of the main reasons I love doing what I do. So the outline for the session, and then we're going to move on to why storytelling. That's going to also include a bit of the history of storytelling and the anatomy of a good story. Then we're going to do questions and answer. Then we're going to do human interest stories, which is the thing I love the most, which are stories where we bring it right down to the individual level. Then we're going to move on to giving people a voice, and that section is going to be about how, as charities, part of our role is really to give people who might be vulnerable or voiceless, basically, a platform and a voice, and be able to kind of show others life from their perspective. And then we're going to do the greatest stories never told, which is something I've always found in the sector is we have amazing stories. We often do a bit too much of keeping them to ourselves, and how we can try and gather them and share them and really use their power to help achieve things as a charity that we might not otherwise be able to achieve. And then we're going to do a little feedback and close. So why storytelling? So for me, the reason I think stories transcend a lot of other forms of communication is that it's a sort of invitation and a window into somebody else's world. It's somebody sharing something quite private usually and intimate with you and asking you to be understanding and to come along with them on that journey and empathise. And I'm going to kind of talk some more around that within this section. Just to confirm, everybody will get a copy of the slides after the session. I know there's quite a lot of information here. We also have some further reading at the end of the slide deck. So you'll all have the copies of the slide and the recording of the webinar. So I think for me, stories ignite the imagination and they help you to live as another, as I already mentioned briefly. Stories are memorable and stories simplify. So I just thought this image was really interesting because it's fairy tales just summed up in one image, and I can quite quickly identify those stories from just one picture, and it brings back the memory and the story and the different moments within that story to my memory, which is quite an amazing thing, really. So stories can be used to enhance your website, email newsletters, social media posts, funding applications, annual and impact reports. And as we will see later, even more than that, it can be used in events and all sorts of things. Pretty much anything you can do as an organisation can be enhanced with stories. I think for me, one of the things when I think of storytelling is it's really as old as we are. Before we even had language, we were telling stories. It was a way that we could sort of share and help others to learn and to see what we've seen, to carry forward traditions and to really kind of imbibe and really help it become part of who we are and what we do and share together, which I think is really amazing. So stories make us human. Stories can be used to educate, to solve problems, to provide pleasure, to assimilate, to teach, to provide pattern and order, to connect and impart traditions. And I can kind of see from those 8 examples, there's quite a few there that I could quickly see we could utilise in the charity sector. We have to do, I say, almost all of those things quite regularly in our work. So one of the things that I love, the picture on the left is an image created by someone around the Lord of the Rings, is that stories are usually inviting someone on a journey and it's much deeper in experience. So other ways of conveying information is usually imposing information upon you, whereas with a story it's much more complex, I think, than that, and you are more vulnerable, and you do have to be quite brave, I think, to share your story. But when you do, the power of that can really go forward. And I think the point here, the last point around, it allows them to integrate the learnings of the story into their world, into their sort of psyche, and then hopefully will make them wish to retell it to others. I think it's really a lovely thought for us to think of as charities. So I just thought this quote from Seth Godin was really interesting. People don't believe what you tell them. They rarely believe what you show them. They often believe what their friends tell them. They always believe what they tell themselves. So what leaders do is they give people stories that they can tell themselves, stories about the future and about change. And I think it's for us as charities to think about how those stories, we can give those stories out and really kind of excite people to get behind the movement that we're trying to create, use stories as a kind of mechanism for that. So a few quotes and advice for some experts, which I think is really quite interesting, because I'm sort of always quite keen to look not just within the charity sector but outside of it. So you have James Cameron here, who's the director of Titanic, talking about that stories is about exploration and going places where others haven't been and returning to tell the story they haven't heard before, which I think is really interesting. And I like the quote about write to one person, because I think if you try to kind of water things down, make them really politically correct all the time and sort of create generic things, the heart and soul is removed, which I think is a real shame. And then the quote at the top, which is, the purpose of a storyteller is not to tell you how to think, but to give you questions to think upon, I really love, because that's powerful when something stays with you and it makes you wonder, it makes you think, do I relate to that? Is that totally out of my frame of reference? It's really an interesting thing, I think. I liked this quote, which I think is usually used around kind of advertising, but I think for us really important to think about, which is that we need to stop interrupting what people are interested in and be what people are interested in. I think that's a kind of shift that we need to make, that we really involve people and make them feel like they are part of this, they're part of that story, and really empower them to kind of help to share that and get other people excited about it, and not just sort of constantly being saying, oh, please donate, oh, this. You know, it's making something really compelling that they're intrigued by and they want to be involved with, as like a kind of almost like a magnet. I thought Steve Jobs is a really interesting example, because I think fundamentally he was an amazing storyteller, and he created an organization which, well, it's almost a cult really, isn't it? It's something where people will be prepared to queue up at 4 o'clock in the morning to get the new iPad. And we all know really it's not about the fact that it's this little box of technology. They've made it into something bigger, which I think is really interesting. And I think I was fascinated to read about his life, because actually the trajectory of his life wasn't smooth. He had quite a bit of adversity on the journey there, and he was always willing to talk about that quite honestly, which I think is great. And I think it really helps, I think, for us to think about how we can not always try to appear so slick and perfect. I actually think talking a little bit about how things might not always go to plan is a good thing. So the anatomy of powerful stories. So most stories will have an arc where you will have an inciting incident, a confrontation, a climax, a decision, and then a resolution. Hopefully with the resolution, the good guy wins. However, as we know in the charity sector, that doesn't always happen. So I think it's just trying to think about stories that they are complex, that sometimes we might need to change the way we view the story, rejig it, reinvent it slightly to be able to help people to understand the journey that's happened. And I think if you look at lots of the fairy tales, for example, they really cleverly use this structure, and also Shakespeare, for example. So one of the things we can do is celebrate our heroes through stories. Each story has some basic elements: the hero, who's the person that changes, the plot, which are the actions that create the change, the setting where the action happens, and the ending, which is the resulting change. And I thought the example on the left was really interesting because they'd combined imagery and text to try to show the arc of this person. So this is a young lady. This campaign was all about sexual exploitation. So she's sharing that you don't see what's happening until you come here, find out the information and look back on it. I can see what's going on now. It's obvious, it's grooming. And you know, for me, I think what's interesting about that is it's a personal quote from her to show that she's become more aware and able to look after herself and protect herself. But it's also clear that the charity have helped with that intervention, even though it's not explicitly necessarily said within the story quote. They've cleverly put in the actual tweet, it took a support network to help Lauren realise that she was being exploited. But what I like about this campaign is it's showing a change, but it's also, I think, quite interestingly working on prevention, because hopefully other young people might see this and actually think, actually, that's something I need to check. So once upon a time there was, so often when I think of storytelling, I think a lot of people think of the sitting by the campfire and telling the scary stories. And I think it's really interesting for us to think upon that, because I don't think we necessarily take the time to do that. And I think we do need to kind of constantly remind ourselves that we do need like hooks and payoffs within our story. We need to try to really demonstrate clearly and simply how that story has evolved and how the characters within it have changed. And I think sometimes we make assumptions of what other people might know, we make the story complex, and I think really stories need to be very, very simple and really use as ideally as basic language as you possibly can. So I liked this quote about that stories about helping people to see what you see, and this little girl Anastasia saying, I really wish I had more independence so you don't have to be told where to go or what to do. And I just thought that was quite interesting because I'm not 9, but that's helped me have a window in her world. And if you are a charity that is encouraging children to be more active and play more, you could use a quote like this to help convey both the need of that person who's craving more of a sense of freedom, but also the impact, so we can show that that is something that's really important to them, and something that we can do simple things to help to change. It's just bringing people along, inviting them to try and understand somebody else's perspective. So I thought this was interesting. The future of storytelling isn't about telling anyone anything. It's about story making, where the brand facilitates, taps into stories that people are creating and sharing with each other. And I think interesting to me because with social media that is so much more possible. So for example, we had a tweet this morning when we came into the office from a charity who'd actually come to one of our sessions yesterday, surgery, and she'd sort of said thank you so much for your time, and she'd really enjoyed the session, and she really felt like she could see a way forward. and it was just so lovely to come into the office to see that. So straight away I'm retweeting that, but then I'm also thinking, can I use that then, that little story that she shared with us of her experience, in our next promotional email for that training? Or, you know, just try and kind of maybe engage with them and say, you know, would you like to be a case study? Or there's other things that I can then do and take that story to move it forward. And I think for us, it's about really empowering the people we work with, because I think that's really exciting. If we can help that person in terms of changing their life and turning their life around, but then if we can then take them one step further to say, actually, your voice matters, would you like to share it with others? That's really magical, I think. Human interest stories. So non-profit stories have the unique ability to allow people to feel and want to be part of something bigger. And that was the point I was making just now. I think it's quite an interesting one, where businesses would kill to have the stories that we have, the transformations, the raw emotions, and the kind of powerful, you know, change that we're creating in the world for good. So we need to really harness that and think about how we can make that sort of a movement that they can really get behind and feel excited about. So my first example is the Humans of New York. It's just amazing. So it's simply was a photographer based in New York who would go around taking photographs of people. He then evolved that slightly to ask them a couple of quick questions, but it's now evolved into something so much bigger, where he will spend around an hour with each person, getting to know them, inviting them to open up. And I do find it incredible, some of the things he gets people to say, because they seem so personal and so raw. But I think he's just genuinely interested and really fascinated by people and non-judgmental, and really wants them to share with him. So this example. Okay, great. Oh, okay. Shall we stop and do the questions? Let's stop and do the questions. So how do you maintain the power potential of a story when the subject of the story might have to remain confidential? From Michael. And using stories in research reports, is it too subjective? Okay. So Sarah, I'm not quite sure. I'm going to assume that you're talking about using stories in research reports is almost like you're doing mini case studies where you're going to talk about a person and kind of bring it to life. I personally think that that's always useful. Perhaps you might not put lots in, you might pick, say, 2 or 3, but I think it really brings things to life, and I think it helps people to, I think it's like we're all human, so whoever's going to be reading that report, if you do have real world stories in there, they're going to be more likely to really connect with that on an emotional level and want to know more or take action in some way. I'm sure we could try and dig out some examples of that. So if you'd like to drop us an email, I can follow that up for you. And then the power potential of the story when the person might need to remain confidential. We're actually going to cover that in a later section, so I know that might seem like a cop-out, but I would like to leave that question till that section, and then I'm going to come back to the question and show you some examples of that. I hope that might be okay, Michael. Okay, so back to Humans of New York. So this story is about a kid that he met on the street in Brooklyn, in a very deprived area. He asked the kid, whose name was Vidal, who had most influenced you in your life, and he talked about his head teacher who had really made an impact on him and told him stories and told him that he mattered, and it really touched Brandon, who's the guy that runs Humans of New York. And he decided to follow that up by going to the school and interviewing the head teacher. And the story is that she was just about to give up. She had really tried her hardest to turn this school around, and she thought nobody cared, and she had just told her mother the night before she didn't think she could do it anymore. And Brandon came, and they sort of had so much interest when people wanted to help. They actually started a little fundraising campaign, an online donation, and they had some smallish target of 100,000 where they wanted to take the kids on an annual visit to Harvard to raise their aspiration. They raised over £1 million. They have lifted the entire area. They've been on Ellen DeGeneres. Target have given them a load of money for all of the schools in the area. They went to visit Obama, the kid interviewed by Obama, and it just really amazed me, the power of one little story that Brandon sort of felt strongly about. He wanted to then follow up. He doesn't usually do that, and it just sort of really flew, and it just shows you that anything is possible, really is. He's recently been doing a feature on the refugee crisis, and he actually went over to Turkey and interviewed people, but he's back in America now, and he's sharing some of the stuff, and some of the information is around people who are going to be moving to America, but this lady applied but has actually been turned down. But it's just really interesting to me because I don't know if you can see it well, but I could just see how this style, very simple, just taking an interview with someone and taking what they say and conveying it, can be used to really strong effect. So most of the posts that Brandon posts have huge amounts of engagement in terms of likes, but also comments. And I love the comments because people talk a lot about trolling online, but on Honey it's so supportive. Everybody just restores your faith in the human spirit because everybody really wants to help these people and really sees life from their perspective and feels inspired and starts to realize that we're all very interlinked and much more similar than you might think. So I really recommend having a look at Humans of New York. They actually do the stories sometimes. They'll just crop the image where you can just see the person's hands or even feet sometimes, so that makes it more confidential, as Michael was mentioning, and then the quote just has a first person's name, the first name of that person, and a quote. But it really does hit home when you have this first person speaking, sharing their story. There's a new one that's been created for London, which I thought was quite cool. We feature quite a few charities in theirs. So this one's just a story of a lady who's a volunteer, and you can see the story that, her husband passed of cancer, and this charity helped them, and in return she really wanted to give something back to them. And it's just a lovely story, and I think it's a story that most charities could tell in some way, shape or form. I mean, we could even do that ourselves. We had a message from a volunteer today saying he's got a job and he's really happy, but he wanted to let us know, which I thought was really lovely. And I think it's us trying to kind of think about how we, in a way, we can thank volunteers by doing this, by sort of sharing that they do so much for us and giving them that platform to speak. So this example I just liked because it shows on the left the actual problem, and then it has the lady who's speaking, and I just think it really helps you have a window into what's happening with them and the problems that they're going through. And you can see they got 57 retweets and 48 likes on that story. So I think it is very powerful, a way of getting people to just have a quick, that's what that person's life is like, moment, which I think is really powerful and moving. This is just an example of a charity who are using stories on their website. So again, it's a lady whose partner had died, and the charity kind of gave her really just a reason to come out for the day and keep going and have things that kept her busy. But I just really liked the pictures that they'd done that have warmth, and there's a link at the bottom if you wanted to have a little look at how they've done it. But I thought it was really warm and nice, and a really nice kind of way of, instead of saying, oh, we have knitting groups, you know, you could do it from the perspective of an individual and how that's helped them. So recently we went to the AGM of a local charity, Aylesbury Youth Concern, and I thought it was really powerful that at the event they actually had coached a young person to actually speak to the group, and it was obviously really hard for him to do that. His name was Ben. He's basically been in and out of prison since he was 16 years old. He has no support from family or friends, and the charity were there for him, and he was on quite hard drugs. His lifestyle wasn't the greatest, and they've really kind of believed in him and told him that he can do it, and he in turn was really brave and shared his story with the group of how that charity has helped him. And I just thought it was a lovely example of how you could even use real stories at an event. And I think he actually really quite enjoyed sharing his story by the end. You know, I chatted to him after and shook his hand, and I think for me that was the highlight of that AGM. That story of Ben is going to stay with me forever, because, you know, he had no one, and he's now looking to get a job and have a future that he can actually, you know, think and imagine and work towards, and he has something to stay straight for, you know. I also met a guy called Darren at the Social Charities, and it's themed around storytelling, and Darren actually opened the conference. Quite a hard thing to do because there were 180 people there. But it's just fascinating to me because he was a delegate at the previous year, and he was so inspired by the stories. He's now basically making it his life's work. So he's shared his own story, and then he's now really about empowering and encouraging others to do the same. So I think with storytelling it can be quite infectious, and I think it's interesting for us as a charity. I think it is part of our responsibility to make sure those stories are told, but also to try to work towards empowering our groups to tell it themselves in their own terms. So I just thought I'd kind of give a bit of a marketing example. Not sure if it might be helpful, hopefully. So functionally, Nike design and make trainers and sportswear, but they say in their marketing and comms, just do it. So I find it quite interesting because it's trying to, again, elevate things and tell stories that are beyond just what the day-to-day physical, factual things we're doing are. It's standing for something bigger, and I think that fascinates me. So I've just got a little example of that. So Petite Miracles, who I help, functionally teaches long-term unemployed people how to upcycle furniture. They take unwanted furniture, restore it, sell it from their shop, and raise money to make charity sustainable. Gosh, that's a big kind of sentence. And then I sort of just suggested, could we say we're giving people and furniture a second chance? Because it's just a nice, simple way of trying to convey both what we're trying to do, but also the impact of what we're trying to do. Just trying to kind of create a hook that someone else might be intrigued enough to kind of think, oh, that's quite interesting. And then I think we can take that one step further, where you can say buy an upcycled desk and help a Londoner back into work, which I think is quite interesting. So rather than us do ads about either furniture that's for sale or we're a charity that help people get back on their feet, we're trying to kind of combine those two things into a little story there. And then a sort of deeper story about an individual is Ayub, who came to us through the work program. He's now actually running the workshop. So it's really quite a nice thing to kind of see a person who came to them. He'd been unemployed for, I think, nearly 2 years. And he showed some initiative, and that initiative paid off, and he now is employed by that charity, and he now teaches other people who are just like him. And I think that's lovely because he's been there, you know, he's been that person, so he can really powerfully convey to them and help kind of motivate them. And for me, the charity is so inspiring just because, you know, both the furniture and the people have effectively been discarded by society. People aren't interested. They've been knocked back so many times and told they're worthless, and the charity combines the two. The person transforms the chair, and then the person themselves is transformed. It's just really an amazing process. So I just wanted to show a couple of more real examples of the Ovarian Cancer Action charity. Actually have a section on their website. I don't know if you can see up here, your stories. And then they feature individual stories, and you can click through to read more about them. And I just thought that would be such a cool thing if charities had that a bit more, where on their websites they actually showed, you know, what actually their beneficiaries and people they help, their story, and act as a platform for that. Oh no, my dots are still there and I'm not quite sure how to take them off. There we go. Right, starting with the story. So I thought Simon Sinek was actually mentioned at the conference by the keynote speaker, but I thought it was quite interesting for us to think about why do we use stories to make the invisible visible, how we need to try and design visual stories, and what we need to playfully create clarity and unearth purpose. So I think you can see that in quite a few of the examples I've already shared. So this slide is a bit scary, but it's really quite important. So why are we telling the stories? So there's usually a reason behind it where we're trying to create, most charities in some way, shape or form are trying to create change. Might be their campaigning, might be their health organisation that trying to make people fitter. It might be Macmillan or a cancer charity where they're supplying nurses to help people who have cancer. It might be that they're a research organisation to try and find out cures for cancer. So I think it's just interesting for us to kind of come back to what is it we actually want them to do. Are the stories to facilitate them to stop doing something or to start doing something? There's so many different things that they could do, but I think it's trying to kind of make it really easy for people to then act, because the story is going to put them in that mode of I'm interested, and we have really a very short moment in time to then try and convert them to actually take action and do something as a result of that connection. I just think empathy creates change. So when you read a story that you feel connected with, you sort of really start to feel strongly about that and get behind that idea. And I think this charity comms document's worth everybody having a quick look at, because there's some really useful stuff in there about working with beneficiaries and case studies, and there's like photo permission forms in there and all sorts of goodies. So neural coupling. So for me, the thing that I was talking about earlier, where stories create this sort of almost brain-to-brain connection, I think is really, really powerful. And I think the only time that really happens is when we are vulnerable and we do share something that is very personal to us. But I think we don't have to always necessarily think of that as the beneficiary. So it could be a volunteer, like we saw an example earlier, or it could even be a staff member. You know, why do your team love to work in your charity? What is behind that, the motivation behind that? So here's just a few examples of some clear calls to action, which was that point that we were talking about earlier about what behaviour change do we want from the stories. So I love the little monkey with his little hand out. They're using the new functionality in Twitter where you can actually donate through Twitter itself, through the donate hashtag. You have a homeless charity at the top who want you to donate to their Christmas appeal. And then there's Papyrus, who are working on a suicide prevention scheme, and they have a person who's fundraising through Just Giving that they're inviting people to donate through. So I just think it's quite interesting to think about how we can tie the story to an action. I think it's quite interesting for me. I watch quite a bit of telly, and especially at this time of year there's lots of ads for charities, and they tend to be one extreme to another. So they're either really sad of children in an orphanage or animals that have been left and abandoned, or they're showing a transformation. So it's sort of quite divided, and I think it's important for us to remember that different kinds of people might need different stimulus. So for me, the adverts with the children in the orphanage would never work for me. They just upset me. I can't watch it. It would never be something that would motivate me to click through and donate. But the adverts about the transformation where it says, this is, I don't know, Ben, he has been in and out of prison since he was 16, but he's now rebuilding his life. Please donate to Youth Concern. That would help me to donate, because I'm the kind of person where I want to focus on solutions. I don't want to, I think I'm too emotionally sensitive for the really sad ones. Well, I just thought it was quite interesting, this emotions that cause action on the right, for us to think about some of the stories and the different kind of emotions that might be stimulated from different kinds of stories, which I think is quite interesting. So we've already seen quite a few, I think, that have sort of sadness maybe to them, or in the case of, for me, the awe of seeing the little kid go and meet Obama. I just think that's amazing. But I think perhaps we need to think a little bit more about that spectrum of emotion and try and make sure we have a variety of stories that might stimulate different kinds of. So we're on a questions and answers. The question is, do we have questions? Oh, we do have questions. Okay. So Caroline from Amersham Band, they are already active on social media but want to take it to the next level to support a specific fundraising campaign. They want to tell the story of the power of music in people's lives and the community and inclusion music groups can bring. Brilliant. I think there's so many elements to that I think you could use. I also think you could also try and link to popular things. So, for example, sometimes the music on something like Strictly Come Dancing can be amazing and the live singing is so beautiful. You could try and tweet at the time that that's on and use the Strictly Come Dancing link. You could tap into, there's quite a few programs now on telly about choirs. I'm trying to remember the gentleman's name on the BBC. He has some really great yeah, I can't remember his name. It's Gareth Malone. Yes, I love those. So again, that could be something you could tap into. I think sharing quotes from the band members, perhaps little videos with Instagram, for example, or really any of the platforms now, you can do quick videos like 20 seconds. I was actually in Marylebone Station the other day, and Wycombe Band, the High Wycombe Band, were actually playing in the station. I took a quick video and posted it. So it might be about kind of encourage, I know this is Amersham Band, but I'm just saying it's quite similar. If you encourage the participants who might listen to the performances to share, that could be quite a powerful way of amplifying your message out to others. So really ask for that, I think. Oh, and thank you, Harriet, for saying you've been inspired. That's really all I can possibly ask for. I'm really pleased. Okay, so we're going to move on because we're fast running out of time. So giving people a voice. For me, this section is tapping into what we touched upon earlier with Ben and Darren, who through the work of the charity decided to find their own voice and have a platform to share their story. There's just a couple of examples here from Changing Faces, who I highly recommend. Actually, a lady from Changing Faces spoke at the Social Media Exchange conference, and she really touched me, and I've been following them ever since. And I just think it's really interesting campaigns that they're running, and they're using ads, which I think is really good. So they're one I think to have a little look at, to kind of see a charity who are really kind of working with their beneficiaries to help them have the confidence to share their story. Group support. So a lady called Jude, who's actually the lady that runs the Social Media Exchange, she worked with a charity called the Maya charity, and they work with women who have had domestic violence problems, and they actually did workshops where they got the women to speak about their experiences, but to one another, mostly through audio, which is another really interesting one around the confidentiality. So all the women were kept confidential, but their stories were shared, and it just fascinates me. Again, it's that kind of contagious element of stories where they, in a way, the stories become part of the service that the charity is providing, because the stories are helping them to unlock feelings and emotions that they've kept inside for a long time. And I think that's really fascinating to me. So you can have a look at the blog about that and how they did it on the link below. Again, this slide's just really about that vulnerability that I've been talking about, and I think I love the quote about, even when the body goes to sleep, the mind stays up all night telling itself stories. And I think the mind makes sense of the world through stories, and our dreams are really a big part of that. This again is another way of working with groups who might be vulnerable and not be able to be featured physically. They basically, a charity worked with young people in Pimlico, and they did loads of like, they took magazines and created sort of like collages of what they wanted, and the idea was the young people were the audience, so they could really help inform the charity on what might appeal to young people and how that poster could create the behaviour change. And then an artist, a lady called Veronica, who I'd actually introduced to the charity, worked with that charity and the young people to kind of create this poster to kind of encourage the change, and that went in buses, and I actually saw it on a bus and took a picture of it because I was like, oh. So that was quite an interesting one, illustration, I think. So how could we use storytelling? We could do interviews with beneficiaries, volunteers, staff or partners. We can share failures and successes. We can share tips and advice. We can gather quotes and testimonials. We can use short video on YouTube or Instagram. The animation on this is not quite gone how I'd like. This is just an example of what we would call user-generated stories, which is basically a person. On the left is a gentleman whose father had a bone marrow transplant. So the young guy in the picture, it's his page, but it's about his dad who'd been helped by Anthony Nolan, and he shared that they're 1 year on from the transplant. And then the charity itself reshared that with their page, because if somebody shares something on your charity page, none of your followers will see it unless you reshare it. But I just think for smaller organisations this can be a really great way, because you don't have to seek out the story. The story effectively is there, it comes to you and it's from the heart, and it's a really lovely, efficient, cost-effective way, I think, of trying to work. But it might need a bit of encouragement and sort of trying to kind of let the people you work with know that you need that kind of thing. I thought this was another interesting example of a reading group in a prison where they can't show the faces of the people, but it's just a playful way of kind of showing that, which I thought was really fun. And I really sort of, that image stayed with me. I actually was using it for another project, but I brought it into this presentation because it really stayed with me for some reason. And then I just wanted to say that it doesn't always have to be necessarily about the beneficiaries. It might be about the staff. So the staff team at RNLI decided to wear the lifeboat crew kit to fundraise for 24/7, which was quite an undertaking. I think a very uncomfortable day for them, but I think they did a really nice job of bringing humour to it and just kind of involving people in something they're doing that's a bit more behind the scenes. I think also it's important just to mention about the fact that stories need to be able to work on mobile. I don't think enough charities think about that, and I think it's thinking about nice big images and not too much text, because when you're on a small screen, you're not going to be able to you're not going to really want to read through reams and reams of text, and you're going to want a really nice strong image there. And obviously through social, that's something we can all do now, which is great. Questions and answers. I think we might not have time. I don't think we've had many anyway. Great. Okay, so we're going to move on. So this section is going to be really quick. It's just the greatest stories never told. It's all about how I was saying we often keep our stories to ourselves, so we might come back to the office and chat to a colleague, but it's really important that we identify powerful stories and we make sure they can be shared by the charity. So that might be telling the marketing person if you have a marketing person, or it might be writing it down on email and sending it to all the staff so it can then be amplified. And it's just some tips here on how you can actually do that, which is make sure you value stories from induction. When I worked at the volunteer centre, the lady who founded the project I was on said, stories are our most precious thing, and we're going to share our stories with you, but we now need you to take those forward and collect new stories and carry that forward for us. And that stayed with me. I think it's integrating it into existing processes, like on evaluation forms. Can you put a free text box where you can try and get a testimonial out, and if that's intriguing, maybe follow up for a full case study. Thinking about your consent forms, thinking about, could we in team meeting every now and again share a story that's moved us as a team member. And again, it's looking on social for people who are probably already sharing stories of what they've found working with you, and making sure you find ways to reshare that. Just a slide here for later to read. I think stories are your most precious asset. They need to be organised using a system, and they should be integrated into your wider campaign. So the fundraising campaign that was mentioned earlier. You need to look after your people. Requests need to try and come from a central point, so you don't have a beneficiary being asked to do loads of different things. You need to think about providing media training if you are going to ask them to do lots, but the most important thing is to try and make sure you say thank you to people who have shared their stories and helped you as a charity to get those real stories out there. So there's a challenge to take back to the office to get your team to write a story in a couple of sentences, which I thought would be quite a fun one as a piece of homework. And my final thought, which is, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. Thank you.